So we're going to talk about properties, workbook properties. We'll begin by explaining what the properties are and where to find them, at least some of them. We're going to show the properties on a document panel, describe what that is. We're going to fill in some field values in those properties. We're going to display those properties that we set up in a dialog box. We can also display those properties in a Windows Explorer window. And then finally, we're going to remove the properties. So I'm in a blank workbook, book 1, and we're going to go take a look at the properties for this workbook by pressing Alt-F, go to the File tab backstage, and these properties are listed. Some of them you can populate yourself. Some of them are populated automatically. The file size is populated automatically. The last modified date and the created date is populated automatically. The related people fields, the author and the last modified by, are also populated automatically. And you can left-click this toggle switch to show all properties, and it just dropped down just a little ways. That's because there's only a couple other properties set up for this workbook. But there are many, many properties that you can establish for the workbook, and we'll see some of that in this movie and more in a movie later on covering advanced properties. So I'm going to show fewer properties and show you that you can populate these field values here, or you can left-click this drop-down and show the document panel. So we have this panel, this document panel that's displayed above the worksheet. We have some property fields that we can set some values for. The author field is populated automatically for me. We have the path, that's the location of the workbook, and we have a reminder that the fields with the red asterisk are required fields. Now, we don't have any required fields. These required fields are generally set up for SharePoint. And when loading spreadsheets into SharePoint, you may have some metadata, which is what these properties are. It's data about data that's required so that when you get into SharePoint, the users can find your spreadsheet based on the field values for those required properties, which is a hint, actually, for what we can use the fields for, and we're going to get there in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to populate these fields with some values, a couple of the fields anyway. I'm going to populate the subject field, and I'm going to put in some keywords into the keywords field. And I'm going to separate each one of these by a semicolon. And since I made some changes in the workbook, I set up properties. I'm going to have to save my changes. And the next thing I want to do is close the workbook by pressing Control-W, which will close the workbook without closing the application. So we set up some field values for a spreadsheet. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, I'm going to show you why you might want to do it. We're going to open up that spreadsheet by pressing Alt-F-O, go to the computer, and in recent folders, recent places, the desktop has my workbook. There are properties that are showing on this dialog box: the date modified, the type of file that it is, and the size that it is. But by right-clicking the area that contains the column headings, we can add more column headings, including the properties that we set up just a minute ago. I'm going to have to expand this a bit so we can see it. There are actually numerous properties that you can define a value for and set up a column to display in these dialog boxes. But that's for another time. So again, why would we want to do this? Well, because you can search for spreadsheets based on the values you've established for your properties. And we separated 3 of the tags by a semicolon. When you do that, each one of those tags behaves as a separate identifiable item. So you can have 2, 10, 20 different tags on the same workbook and use this drop-down to sort, filter, and search for your workbooks. This might be a far better way to organize your workbooks than using a complex, multi-layered, embedded folder structure that sort of, at times for me, kind of drives me nuts to try to get my data organized using folders. So this is an organizational option that you might explore or make use of. So you have the same option with Windows Explorer. You can add columns that will allow you to display the properties and enable you to search on the field values that you've established for your workbooks in those property fields. So you may want to, at some point, delete all the values that you've set up for these property fields. Well, there's a couple of different ways to do it. We can go to Alt-F, and I can select the field directly and then press delete and delete those values. But you may have many fields that are containing property values, and you may miss one or two of them. So a more complete and automated way to do it is to go to the Inspect Workbook, Inspect Document, and clear all of these checkboxes except for the second one, which says Document Properties and Personal Information. Once I get done clearing all those other checkboxes, I'll left-click Inspect, and it tells me the following document information was found. Document Properties, Author, Absolute Path to the Workbook. I can left-click Remove All, Close, and we've cleared the properties that we set up because we had some tags for this workbook. So that's Workbook Properties. We described what the properties were. We displayed the default property fields on the document panel. We set up some field values for some of the properties. We looked at the functionality that those property values serve in the dialog box when you're opening up a worksheet, and mentioned that you can do the same thing in Windows Explorer. And finally, we removed the properties.